Welcome, everybody. You know we never start on time, but we thought tonight we will start on time because we are altogether too fortunate to have Denise with us tonight, especially on her 81st birthday. As Denise starts heading into the last 20 years of her career, I think it's just a great moment to be with her and to treasure every minute. So I won't speak for long, but just to kind of clarify, Denise is African. If you think a little bit and if you watch carefully what she is saying and what she has written, there's no question where she's coming from. Of course, she's here tonight in New York, the great kind of immigrant capital, which means the capital of people who are changing directions and changing speeds and are not certain about the future, which is why cities gather these people together, and then together the future actually is realized by such dreams. But the story starts in I guess northern Rhodesia. It was at that time. Yes. So and then to Johannesburg to study architecture at WITS, then to London Architectural Association, then across to the United States to Penn, planning. Then somewhere along the line was a switch from being a student to a teacher. I think it probably happened back in WITS. I think when I was 4 years old. When she was 4 years old. I rest my case. She was always a teacher, so therefore she always had teachers also, and it's one of the marks of Denise's brilliance, I think, is her acknowledgement and constant memory of the teachers that she had. But there's no doubt that those very same teachers, if they were in this room, would say, well, no, it was actually the other way around. It was Denise that was running the show and making us think in a more lively way. But this story that starts in Africa makes its way, of course, towards the States, towards the office in Philadelphia, passing through almost every architecture school you can think of. I left out the West Coast, where a lot of the early pedagogical experiments are there. Actually, the syllabi of your classes on the West Coast are still available, and you can watch the development of the pedagogy. I'm saying all this because we need some kind of an explanation of why it is that in our field you can, since the Second World War, you can make your own shortlist of who you regard to be the intellectuals of the field. And if you make a really, really short list, Denise Scott Brown is in that list. And so the question is why? Like, why did somebody get to be so annoyingly good and influential? And by the way, it's really, really hard to write a good book. It's astonishingly difficult to write a book that really changes the field. It's unacceptable to do more than one, right? Completely unacceptable. So it's with great reluctance that we will listen to Denise, who has produced 4 or 5 really astonishing books that I don't have to name to you because you were already taught by those books and therefore taught by Denise, and not by accident. Those books are often coming out of classes, out of teaching, most obviously with Learning from Las Vegas and the kind of experiment of thinking about the new American vernacular landscape. And Denise is, of course, somebody who has taught in all of the most elite of architecture schools, but has always been the least tolerant of elitist thinking. So in a certain sense, this has been the strategic move to be inside the home of pretension and to undermine that by simply asking people to look at the world around them. So I'm saying very, very all too fast that this is an extraordinary thinker, teacher, and designer who has refused to be boring for 81 years, and I think in the next 20 years has no intention of being anything other than the wonderful person that she is. And I really mean this about intellectuals. There are a lot of bright people in architecture, and there's a lot of smart people and a lot of beautiful people, and we're all nice and somewhat pathetic in our love of the built environment, so we kind of like each other. But there are every now and then 1 or 2 real minds in the field, and Denise is one of those. Denise.
Well, thank you for giving me a wonderful birthday celebration where, can you hear me, by the way? Where the gift to me is to let me speak. And I do that too much, and this is one of those occasions where I've got much too much to say, and let's just see how quickly I can say it. And one of the reasons we have pressure on us is I think we all want to see that debate tonight. And that's where I'll be going at 8:30 sharp to get there by 9 and watch it. And it's not incidental to the subject matter. So I use the word fuse, and I mean infuse, refuse, defuse, profuse, confuse. There are others too, but the notion of things joining as a theme for tonight. And you mentioned my own origins in Africa, but from Eastern European family, and my education happened on 3 continents, and there was social unrest in every place I was educated. 1930s and 40s, Johannesburg as apartheid became law. It had always been there, but became law, and the kind of student uprisings against that. The early 1950s to mid-1950s in England particularly, but also Europe, where socialist governments and, again, rethinking after the war. And then America, where everything was so full of decorum. Can you believe that? And that was the 1950s, and the students were so good. And within 2 years, there was upheaval and unrest and the things I knew about. And the interesting thing was that those experiences nested, and I can, at the end of my age, say there is a coherence to them, which was totally inapparent to me when I was your age. I was saying, I need structure in my life, I'm lost. Now I look at it, how could I have been lost? Look how the things went into sequence. And in America, I'd formed questions by my travels, and I began to find not the answers, but how to go about looking for the answers in a series of disciplines around architecture. I talk about having a wide window on architecture, but even more looking onto a wider view. And then, because the way I think is, I'll then turn around and say, but when you narrow the view, so a very wide view and ability to narrow it and to know how to do that. So our education teaches us that. There's very few places in the university where you do learning for doing, medicine, law, engineering, architecture, and we have a lot of thought about how you teach for making. You learn by doing and you learn for making. There's a profusion of fusion in our education. That's why we get to be leaders of teams in all sorts of places, because we're the only people who've been taught how to think about everything. But we still don't think about everything, and in urbanism, for that reason, we've made some very bad mistakes. Now, going on, the term socioplastics, which says social concern and social activity as a way of thinking about making form. And I think Peter Smithson coined that phrase, and he later said, you can't do it. You can't get sociologists to work with you. They'll have to extend their discipline. Well, I have disagreed with that, and a lot of my time has been spent thinking about how you do that. And I can trace out a geography of social concern. And it goes through architecture, sociology, politics, and economics. And it uses these fields in different ways, with economics being in the end the one that really helps you turn social patterns into physical patterns. They have disciplines for doing that, and I want to talk about that. But into all of this comes tonight and Obama. And my experience of going through the 1960s and seeing the same things happening now, the sudden discovery of poverty. Someone said that the euphoria of discovering a problem, and that's happening right now. People are at last beginning to talk about poverty. And you see, you can't talk about poverty because you lose the middle class until the middle class gets poor enough to let you talk about poverty. But I've been watching Obama because, you know, he came up He doesn't want to talk about it, and he shouldn't, because he'll lose the middle class. But through Alinsky in Chicago, well, Alinsky's heritage was what was taught me by people from Chicago at Penn. Now, the architects were saying, how can you mess with all those churlish social planners? And I found them very challenging, and the only other person at Penn who sympathized from the architecture school was Bob Venturi. Even Lou Kahn said, how can you mix with those people who think about 2.5 people? But Lou had enough experience in planning to know what he meant, and he could be critical of that, but he at least knew more than many other people. But so anyway, Obama learned not to say poverty, and I was listening to the code words for poverty for 2 years with him now, and he uses them. You know what he says for poverty? All those people who want to be middle class. 1960s, he would have said the poor. He doesn't dare say that now, but that's what he says. So I think he's got them in mind as much as I do, and I still do. So now let's go on and deal with the slides and show my theory through slides. Why are you laughing? What can this have to do with what I'm talking about? Everything. How do crowds form? Why does this crowd form? Why does it look kind of riveting? What are they doing? Well, we know they're sunbathing. They're on a beach. Can you see that they're all facing one way? Can you hear me still? Yes. Okay. Now, yeah. Look how these people are all facing this way. And in little groups, sometimes alone, but they look almost like magnetic iron filings under a magnet. And in urban economics, they do talk about city physics, so you can see where I'm going. But obviously the ocean is here. Not only the ocean, but the sun is here. Look at all the shadows. So the order that you're seeing in that is on one level the attraction of something here. But there's also a repulsion. Look at the equal spaces, more or less equal. That's a bit bigger. Is that the king sitting there? Who's under that big umbrella? But you see how there's a group, but then look at the spaces around the groups. It's almost like if you added another 25 people, the same thing would be, but it'd all be closer together. And that is people getting as far as they can away from each other, but not their friends, but from everyone else. This is not a civic place. This is the public place. In a public place, you all go to do a private thing. In the civic place, you go as a congregation, an audience, to enjoy together. So look at all the urbanism you can learn from this. And these regular patterns of behavior that we're looking at here is what the economists have taught me, and I think it helps answer Peter Smithson's problem about you can't learn enough from the sociologists. If you will know these things, it will help you make form out of it. Now, here is something else. One man, and you know who this is, and he can draw a crowd of 1 million people. And I want you to know that our postmodernism, someone's got an interesting question about why I reassigned the name postmodernism to us. It was because of this. Our postmodernism came out of things like this, like Martin, oh boy. I don't know what I did there. How did I get, took me to the, oh, I know what I did. Now, how do we get back? I double-clicked, it took me to the end. There, we want to be there. Now, so the next picture, there. The crowd that forms here is not the only reason a crowd forms. And very, very basically, where two highways cross, lots of things happen. Fortresses are formed there in primitive places because you can see your enemy coming in two directions where highways cross. But more to our way of thinking, oh, I forgot, I should have said, postmodernism came a whole lot out of the social movements then and out of other protests before that. And I want to tell you about that when someone asks me about it. But to go on right now, where two busy highways cross is where a market forms, where lots of people pass in both directions. It's the maximum number of people. That's where you get a marketplace. And in the academic planning that I do, that's where you get a meeting of minds, meeting of ideas or meeting for sale, and that's where you, in the end, get the most people wanting to settle, and that's why you get rent curves, or to like that, and the skyline of New York. And all of those relationships, that city physics, I think is a very important addition to architectural function as we define it. And I am a modernist. I'm updating modernism by my postmodernism, not turfing it out, but I am trying to make it relevant. And the thought of functions at that scale as affecting not only the outsides and surroundings of buildings, but the insides too, is, I think, a main addition I want to suggest to you. So now, going on. Here you see crowds forming. Now, we know that one of the arguments against urban renewal of the 50s, and it still holds, is architects design public spaces, but the public goes somewhere else. And we went to look at Las Vegas because Herbert Gann said, why don't you go and look where people actually go? Because they're not going where you want them to go. So these are spaces that I've designed. This over here, people sent me a photograph saying, we know you'd like to see this. This is a big lab building. This is a complex which you're going to see soon. There's sun here, and this is a day where people want sun, so they sit here. When they want shade, they can sit over here. And all of this is it's provided as something which is not a bench. It's a not bench. And if you give students a bench, they will lie on it or dance on it, but they won't sit on it. So you give them an opportunity revealed rather than demonstrated for sitting. And that's what people here have found at lunchtime. And it warms my heart. I love to see a beautiful building. Aesthetics absolutely is part of what I want to make things beautiful in my own agonized way. But I also would love to see people using it as I hope they would. But I didn't have to put a sign saying, take your photograph here. There are no Kodak moments in these directives. That's all that they find it for themselves, like a jungle gym. And here's another one at Penn. People sitting around in this quad that we made. It's this one there, and there's some more. You can see there's crowds in this place here, in front of Houston Hall. It had got completely deserted, but when I was there were crowds like this, and there was one young man I always remember used to sit cross-legged on this little parapet at its entrance to the Student Union building there. He sat cross-legged there. He wore a white shirt and black jeans. And the next year there he was in architecture school, and it was John Lobel. You guys probably know John Lobel. He practices in New York. Anyway, I always remembered that, and when we came to be planners here, I asked, why did this get deserted, and how can we bring it back? And you see, we brought it back. All of these buildings, those two projects and this one, were all designed by the theory I'm going to show you. And that one looks very empty there, but that's a space used by people to go to school, for example, in the morning. They use it as a shortcut, and I'll explain more to you about that too. And here's the other one designed like that. That's the University of Michigan Palmer Drive Life Sciences Complex, which we designed in these principles. Of course, many other principles too. This is just functionalism. Think of all the other layers of meaning that you add. But it's another kind of functionalism, and it's very easy to understand, even though it gets very highly computerized. And it's something that can give you a very interesting point of departure for complex planning. And Bob's mother's house has got the same principles. If you look in there, you'll find in embryo everything I'm talking about here. And then more. I mean, it's got Michelangelo, Porta Pia, it's got Baroque altars and everything. But okay, the notion of pattern in human activities that I've started with here. You can see, this is Chicago, and it shows the concentric form of a city and the rail. On the other hand, there's a lake, so it's half a city. And these are called desire lines. They're diagrams. These are computer wannabe diagrams, shortly before computers were invented to do this. But again, the notion that every person lives somewhere and has a job somewhere, and you can, by computer, link those patterns, and you get lines of where people want to go. Notice, they can go here, but they don't want to. Here's where they want to go. Now, this is very clear here because it's still the railroad city of the 1950s. It gets filled in by suburbia later. So these are the same ideas of where there is a central meeting point because of lines of movement coming here. That's where you get the highest density. And then as you go out further, it gets lower and related very much to the forms of movement as it goes out. And the cars give another pattern. And this, again, was pioneered in Chicago, this thinking. And the notion then of concentric circles of development, which give rise at the center to the high-priced product, which means high-rise buildings, high rents here, and regional agricultural economics. That's where you grow strawberries, and here's where you grow potatoes. That will be half a day by, or 2 days by wagon. That will be walking distance. Here's the skyline of New York. Von Thunen started that in Prussia in 1819. New York looks like that. The World Trade Center was off-center, and now I drew this before then. I drew these in the 1960s. Architects are thinking this way now. Here is a town which is like that, but Princeton came and put a very powerful other source. It could have been a head commissar put something there in a Russian society. It made all these distort. So the patterns are always there, but they will distort for a Central Park. Go and look how the buildings jostle each other along Central Park to get onto the park, but they never do, because the public is strong enough to fight off that pattern where it doesn't want it. This is another regularity, the journey to work. People going in the morning, fewer at lunchtime, and coming back in the evening. I think it's very beautiful and evocative. Here's another pattern. The Pope commissioned this of Noli in 1748 to show where the churches were and the public spaces for pilgrims, and then the private sector is shown in cross-hatching, and the insides of the churches in poche of their plans. It's another form of pattern which is very, very evocative. All of these are strangely evocative to me. They're kind of gossamer. And they show movement and growth and how things change over time. And then I liken it to the work of Paul Klee, which suggests to me that in the sciences there are very wonderful patterns, and you can use them without losing fantasy. He will show you sine curves that form the face of a woman with nightmares, and that's the invitation to a party at the Bauhaus, I think. So that's my analogy for saying these things can make beauty. Look how similar those are. They're very good to design with. And here again you see Philadelphia, and this is again in the 50s with the main line, it's called, it's famous. And here is Lancaster County, which is agricultural, and this was drawings we did for a studio where I was a student. We show the concentric circles, we show the towns half a day's journey by wagon, the relation to a town on the water. And when it's an undisturbed pattern, when it's not mountain country or anything, you can see it almost the way people like Christalla in the 1930s in Germany drew them as diagrams. And from that, I had a love of looking into existing patterns. Land use, 1958. Chester Rapkin, who was my professor of economics, he used to say, if you put in an existing old city all the land uses on all the floors of all the buildings, you get a pattern that looked like a bruise. And this is the nearest thing to a bruise I found. But when you go poring over it, there are lovely things in here, lovely combinations of, you know, the standard land use colors, red for commercial. This is meant to be green, it's sort of faded. Green for parks and green space, yellow for residential, and then it could be sort of a beigey color for denser residential or high-rise. And it's lovely to analyze all of this and see what you can learn from it. It's amazing what you can learn for use in that. So one of the things we did in the Las Vegas studio, I don't know why this is a bit blurred, I hope you can see it. We took the casinos, which are wildly different shapes, and we, that's meant to be yellow. It looks green, but it's meant to be that color. The rooms we made in yellow, obviously the patios we made in green, and then red was for the gambling areas, and blue for the convention areas, and so on. And once you did that, these very different patterns are all the same. You always come straight into the gambling, and then you go through to the patio and to the housing in all of these. It's a way of analyzing and a way of thinking that gives you another grasp on functionalism, another way of designing. And this is Las Vegas, and here I'm showing how, oh boy, sorry for that, how this is a wonderful little tool, but it should have the buttons a little more separate. The food stores are the same as they would be in New Haven or even New York. Again, related to corners, related to various things. This is downtown. Of course, food stores go into shopping centers and other parts, in suburban parts. And there are churches, which surprisingly like New Haven when we looked at this. Now, over here are auto rentals, and they're very much tied to commercial strips. And here are wedding chapels, totally tied to the strip. Now, one of the things you have to do when you do this kind of analysis for city physics is think of what are the cogent variables. When we analyzed Memphis, we looked at the jazz clubs. Now, you don't only do that, but that's one of them. So I wanted people here to look at meat distributors and where laundries were, and also land values. And for all those, they said, you can't learn that information, don't even ask. Those are the ones to do with the mafia. And then about land values, said, if you knew that, you'd be the most powerful person in Las Vegas. And here, this is my photography of Zululand and a City Planning Commission map of transportation lines in Philadelphia. And if you don't believe that economic forces are determinants of urban form, what would you make of all of this? Here is a subsistence economy, a barter economy. There's no trade. These are cow paths. We talk about cow paths for Boston. Here are the real cow paths. And this is where a little family clan will live, and they cultivate, they scratch out a living in this poor soil here, made poor by their custom of giving cattle as dowries for brides. So they have too much cattle grazing, too many cows grazing here, and their feet wear these paths and cause erosion. But look at how the housing comes out of the fields. It's the same material as the fields. But mainly we're saying, look at the pattern of movement and settlement here. And then this is a capitalist economy subtended by its transportation system. And those differences are the most cogent way I can use to say that form follows forces, not only form follows function. And now I'm coming to some of the projects and how we use that kind of information. This is Penn. It's a very interesting campus in the sense that it is in a city, and you can see the city here. The city is here, down here. and there's its core and its outskirts. There's medical school and fields here, which you see there. This is a system we've shown here, the open space system. Some very small and some very big, and all used in different ways. And the relationship between this and this, I think, makes Penn a pretty lively intellectual place. In Columbia, you know all about that because you live in the best one for that. And very quickly, we made the case that Penn, I can't read that over here. Cristina, can you read that? And so here, if you can see that little star over there, that is what we're going to be talking about in that kind of relationship. And so the kind of distributions you saw us doing in the Las Vegas studio, here we began adapting them for campuses. So we went to the rosters of freshman students and we pulled up 200 as a sample, and we mapped where they lived and where they went to their first class. And we got these patterns here. If we'd included graduate students, there would have been much more here. And the volumes come from the numbers of students that we found. And so that is one of those kinds of regularities we're talking about that tell you something about form and almost push you toward a design. Now you can fight these things, but if you want to fight, you have to really, if you want to keep water from, if you want to make water run uphill, you have to be a very, very good engineer. You can do it, but it's expensive. So there's only one Central Park in New York, but it's so much loved and so important that no one would let you get rid of it, but you won't get more than one. And that's an outlook for looking at these as well. And over here, you can see the distribution of classroom buildings. And look at this very big one here. And that Perron quad is right in there. And it's right, let me find it now here. I think it's here. And so then we took Perelman Quad. It wasn't called that, it was called Houston Plaza. Houston Hall, the first student union building in the country, much too small, and things had grown all around it. That's where John Lobel used to sit. That used to be very full. When the men's dorms were here, it's not men's dorms anymore, it's everyone's dorms, and they used to go from here to dining here, and then they used to go to classes here. And that's when it was very full. Now they built a whole pile of dormitories down here and a big dining room here. They closed these dining rooms and this whole thing died. So I started looking, and I had other experience which said, all of these buildings have basements, and I discovered from working in Dartmouth, all buildings have more space in the basement than they need, and all students want exhibition space and political space, and the art department says, keep out of our space, and no one else has a place for the student meetings. And then there were the basements. So I said, let's start moving into some of the basements that you can reach here. And we did that here. We put a new big service area here, and you get in underground here from here. So these are all the spaces. As you can see, we've got a NOLI map growing. These are the private places, and here are the places available for student use. That became an admissions center. And here you see, there it is. It became Wynn Commons in Perelman Plaza, and the whole of this became a student center precinct, with the main uses still here, but all of that part of the student center now. And here you see it as a NOLI map. And here is an area that you used to have to come, if you remember the movement system this way. We brought a movement system this way. We lit a dangerous court at night in this very dull building, and we put a 24-hour study hall here and a cafe here, and the entrance to the building's here. That's the biggest classroom building on campus. So it's a magnet. That's why my movement systems work here. And they work here too. And then we put an amphitheater. That's only an amphitheater when you put a person here. And we put a rostrum here. And here you see the overall. People are doing their work here. And down at this end, the rostrum here is near the admissions center, which you saw there. And one day I went by, and there were about 30 very young students all over this thing. And so I'm an old lady walking by, and I suddenly stop and look at these 30 students and start smiling, because they're doing exactly what I wanted them to do. Now they look at me and they can't work out, and they start looking behind them. Can I be smiling at someone else? And I never did tell them why I was smiling at them. But on one day I found someone put a lectern there, and when it's full of people at lunchtime, they have on Wednesdays at noon, a faculty member comes and is allowed to speak for 1 minute on what my field is all about. So it can be a theater if they want to. I thought people rehearsing for music in here could come and play violins here. I have my own fantasies about what they will do. And then you can also put a tent over this whole thing and use it for commemorations and things like that. Now this is Michigan. There's the original commons in this old town. 1840, I think this was. And here that's the commons there. And you can see those 3 buildings that you see here. And then you see that hill, and look at that, and look at where it ends down there, because we're going to say a lot about that space. And your president here asked me to come and look at his campus where he had just returned in 1997. And said, I'd worked with him at Dartmouth, and he said, we want you to think about this campus in the way that you think. So first thing we did was we put a map of all student activities and all land use activities on a map of the region. There's the whole town of Ann Arbor there. There's the university, 3,000 acres of campus, stalking across the region. And then we mapped all the activities of the campus and the town together, and the yellow is all residential. And if you can faintly see it here, you see a browny sort of color there. That's where students rent apartments who don't live in the dorms here. So that shows you a picture of the overall, and we're the first people to have mapped that. And here again, we mapped all the sciences, which go all the way through to a private Pfizer plant here. That's the School of Engineering, and so on. Architecture is there. And then we mapped here, that's the different sciences by the different kinds. Medical research, medicine, nursing, etc. Academic sciences also down here. And here we just showed all the sciences as a pattern. And what can you learn from that pattern? Well, we learned a great deal, because the arts go this way. And you got a meeting of minds between 2 axes, art axis and science axis. And what you do with a meeting of minds, you make it a marketplace of ideas. So here's my Noli map. I learned so many things. Look at this, it's like a macrame, all the pedestrian paths there. So I learned about extending that pattern across that area here, which I showed you. Remember seeing the hills here, and there's that area. It was an old lake once called the Cat Hole. It's got a playing field in it. It was lower than everything else and open. And so the arts go that way, and the sciences go this way. Now, I showed all the arts buildings, auditoria and other buildings over here, and you put them together, and it gives you like a regression pattern in regression analysis of distributions, an arts axis. There's another one here, which is the science axis, and there is a meeting here. these I call desire lines, like the ones transportation planners use. And they start with the sciences here. They come up and they want to go past this arts axis and on to medical research and on to hospitals. And the pattern's like this, and it gives you this triangle here. And that's what we built the Palmer Drive project around. There. We took those paths through like that. This was a hole in the ground. It was an old lake. It was full of parking. And we discovered that they already had a bridge down here which went straight across, and there was no hump in it because of this declivity here. And we said, you can do the same thing. This will be a straight bridge across. People won't even know it's a bridge. And you can put 3 big buildings on it. A lab, another lab, teaching labs, and then over here, a commissary building, a commons building there. And where they meet is our meeting of minds. And there you can see it, the plans. And because we've also been lab designers, we could be thinking about the plans and the typical kinds of buildings they would be using here. We saved them a year because we could show them more or less realistic plans. What people think goes into labs, architects who think they're campus designers, who show you indicative plans, you can't believe what they think a lab can be, but a lab is a big shoebox at the moment. It may change one day. And so we could do that, and they could get the site prepared, which took a long time, because they already knew more or less the layout as we were doing all this planning. And then we showed the arts uses coming this way and this way, the science uses this way, and going on into medical uses, and all funneling through here. What a way to do interdisciplinary work, to meet together in the commons there. And of course, in the sciences, they're trying very hard to bring the disciplines together now. And there you see it, courtesy of Google. There's the lab, the teaching labs and the commons. And that space you saw with the people sitting is right there. Now you see why they use it. And this, to us, to me, is like a medieval road system. I know Venice very well, and I was thinking in Arab towns too, how the road is just narrow enough for its purpose, then opens to widen for getting in, and then narrows again and then goes again, like that. And there you see that meeting of the minds there, and the 3 buildings. There's a lot to say about the kind of architecture we did. We based it on the architecture of Albert Kahn, the person Mies learned from, but the traditional lab and engineering buildings he did on this campus, very beautiful. And then we made them modern, of course. So one thing that happened that really, again, thrilled me, these buildings were in construction, and they all had fences around them. And here goes this bridge through, and it takes you all the way across this road. This road, medics were sending me emails saying, I take my life in my hands when I try to get to my job this way, because of all the cars here. And it was also full of buses bringing students here from outlying campuses. And this was like going to work through a modal interchange right here. And so we got the levels adjusted. And they sent me a letter from the facilities planning people saying, the fences are still up, but the students have broken them down because they've discovered your shortcut, and they're riding their bicycles along them. Again, that's something that I say, my heart rises when I hear that. And here you see this medieval road. And there's the meeting of minds. And then we take the same thinking, we take land use planning, transportation planning inside buildings. You can see it clearly in labs because they have lab benches, which we call housing, offices for researchers, which we call institutional, it's blue, and these spaces, which are storage, they call them, but they're getting to be more and more important in labs, the places where the computers are. And now, and the light, these are based on warehouse design and on, mill buildings, colonial mill buildings, most campus buildings, and we've learned from that. We learned from how Albert Kahn did them as well. And so now these are the roads, and here's the vertical circulation here. where the crossroads meet, there's our coffee shop. So we'll say, where will the next Nobel Prize be gestated? At the lab bench or in the coffee shop? And if you don't like what you see in the coffee shop, it's got kind of open design. If you don't want to meet someone in there, you go right on. But if you see a friend, you stop and have coffee. And the same applies to the planning of this Commons building, with its road, which is that road that comes by this building here, and then goes on along this building. And there is the cafeteria, and there's a store there. And you can see someone in there in the glass windows. You can see it there. And you can stop there and have a meeting. And the dorms, the people who come from the dorms here can also see that at night. So it's all made for serendipitous meeting, not forcing you. You can't make people meet as an architect, but you can remove the barriers to meeting. And that's what we were trying to do. And I was very careful. I called the production architect, who we half and half did the production drawings with them. And I said, even if people change things, which they have to some extent, please keep a big space near the elevator in the basement. Don't let that be made into a classroom, no matter what happens. Because if you do that, the ability to have meeting rooms and restaurant rooms up above will be lost. So I said, whatever you do, don't care what you tell them, but just don't let them fill that space up. It has to be the place where they can where the goods can come in and go up the elevator to where they need to be. And that's why, as that kind of planner, I must stay in this kind of planning right through to the hinges on the doors, because if the coffee shop doors have the wrong hinges on them, they'll close and no one will go into them. So you lose your whole interdisciplinary opportunity because you shut people out. They shouldn't look like lab benches. They should look more welcoming and different. By the way, I went when that building opened and I looked to see what was on the whiteboards on every floor, 7 floors of labs. And on every floor I found formulae all over the boards, except on the ground floor, which is administration space, and it was empty except for one sentence. It said, this pot of coffee brewed at 7:30 a.m. And here's part of that medieval, part of that medieval road. You're coming in this way. And the architecture, the interest is as much in the circulation and the relationships as it is in the architecture, but the architecture, modern. And we wanted it to be white, not the dark brown brick that they had used in other labs, and sort of light-colored inside because of light need in this courtyard. Now this is Beijing, and this is Tsinghua University in the middle of, in one quarter, you can't say the middle of Beijing. And so there's the university. I think it's 36,000 people, and their whole lives can be spent on this campus. And the city around. And I had to tell the Chinese people we worked with, who were all administrators. I was working with top administration at Beijing. I had to say, if I were an American transportation engineer, I'd tell you, you really must go and talk with the city of Beijing, and you must do them some favors, so later you're going to be asking of them a big favor, and they'll want to say yes. And I think that's the only thing they followed in my plan, by the way. Kind of sad. But you see that road, and then it doesn't show on the campus. That's the campus's plan, and then it comes on the other side. And the campus believes it's going to go underground. And I looked at some city maps, and they showed it going right through. So the other thing I said to them is, as you work on maps, maps are like newspapers. They have editorial policy. So you must know the policy of the map makers. Your policy and theirs may be different. There's something else I should say about mapping. You are very interested in mapping here. And I've seen what happens with architectural mapping of cities. Very beautiful evocative patterns from biology are chosen, or digitized patterns of of the brain and things like that, and then laid over cities. And they say, look at the beautiful buildings we can produce by making this three-dimensional. And to me, it's directly like what architects used to say in the 50s and 60s. Let's put all the high buildings on the tops of hills because they look pretty there. Well, you'll see now that high buildings belong where there's a lot of access and a lot of demand, not where a brain pattern tells you, and not realizing that those patterns I show you are relationships, and if you understand the relationships, you can grow the patterns logically. So it's much better to use the patterns from your own related disciplines, like land economics, because they're the ones who will help you produce things which actually get used. So that's, again, just the same thing I'm illustrating here. And here's the Chinese part of the campus, very beautiful. I gave a lecture in this reproduction of a Chinese building, one of the most beautiful lecture halls I've ever been in. And this is the water system that goes through the campus. Here's the Russian section. It's rigid, hard, and dry, kind of wonderful in some ways. These dormitories are very, very interesting. And it's all hardscape. Now, here's the American buildings. It was American prep school built in 1911. And then, you see what the bicycles do to this place? Look at that. These are 1990s buildings, I think. And then I just had to slip that in. That's the truth of bicycles in Beijing. Next thing I'm going to see is a house being transported by 2 bicycles. So this is the delivery system during the day on this campus. I would love this picture. It's so full of Chinese ingenuity. This is the 1991 plan that they wanted us to comment on before they updated it. Here you see this very rigid Russian campus. Here you see the American and Chinese early campus. Here you see the pattern of the water going through, all the way through. And look at that, because we've built on all those patterns. And the first thing we did was make our land use map. They've digitized everything, so it's easy for us to say these are the sciences, dark blue is libraries, pink is administration, red is commercial, and orange is student centers. And we're beginning to see the kinds of patterns that are here. People live on this campus all their lives. Student housing, faculty housing up here, men and women's housing, very segregated. Foreign students kept away from Chinese students. That's what I really took them on. I said, you can't do that. They said, oh, but they have much bigger rooms. They said it shouldn't be that way. And then finally it comes out, the Communist Party dictates it must be that way so that the foreign students won't molest, what's the word I want, change the minds of their students politically. And they said, well, at least now they're allowed to visit. But they could see, they could see that I was saying, if you really want to be one of the top 10 universities, Princeton and Harvard were their models. No, Princeton and MIT were their models. And they wanted to be like them. I said, you really have to have interdisciplinary thinking, and you can't deny the association of people. And then here you see the green space, the symbolic green space that we see here as well. And then a lot of different kinds, recreational green space, little bit of space in with the dormitories, but not very much, and so on. These are systems we're trying to analyze. Ones we're choosing because they are important, and then we disaggregate them. Here you see the volumes of bicycles. Of course, you have to look at the variable of bicycles on a campus like this. And I've been on these streets. Not only are they so full of bicycles, we call them frontal bicycles. They hit you as you're walking this way. And over here are the biggest buildings on campus. That's why the bicycles, the ones with most students. And so also the water this is a drain for all these buildings. So the students go through sheets of water on their bicycles. The water just up on the sides from their wheels. And here was an idea of making densities over here and here, and then you could draw the bicycle patterns away and there'd be room for other kinds of movement over here. So that's one of the ideas that comes out of this kind of analysis. Here's the green space in particular. You can also see all the student centers there in the library. But this symbolic green space we left out the others. This is Russian green space. And so looking at that, here is where the great crowds of people are. No green space. Here is where the bicycles are, amongst all the people, causing chaos there. And all of that green space, the color there is students not admitted. Can't walk in there. So you can't walk in the nicest green space. They said we'd be overrun, we'd have no green space left. So that very much directed our plan. There was also something which said, here is an area scheduled for considerable change in the future, down here. And here's an area where you can have a lot of change in the future. And here's areas which you really can't change, either because they're new or they're precious. And so patterns of hot and cold, areas which are suitable for working and areas where you can't work is another pattern we worked to. So look what we did. We took the green space that's there now and we extended it up along the waterway. Now first we made a big pattern here. And they said, no, you can't. This is scheduled for recreation. And we have our norms. Norms are the bane of social planners' lives. Everything has to be so many for the acre. But we said we won't argue that one now, or the social control you do by active sports. Every authoritarian institution likes a lot of active sports and not too much passive sports. Not too much Telegraph Avenue and a lot of playing fields. So we said, look, you can make a very thin line and you can still do it and we'll take remarkably little of the sports. And it will just soften this area. So that's the framework for a lot more building, bringing density up here and here. And you see that path, it's that path. We say use that as a model, get a lot of your movement here and protect your roads for other uses. And here is the pattern of a very big student center linking these. This campus is the most detached, defused campus you can find. So if you can get a big student center there and a big auditorium here, that, if you use the levels right, will help you make a connection here. And then departmental additions there, and then high density here near the student dormitories up here. So that was our recommendation to them. And then we showed the linkages that would happen. And we were looking about how will you get the library well linked to this. It shouldn't be too hard, but you should. And then that is a very important site. The only thing we could get them to admit that they would do is keep that site open. They had scheduled it for administration. We said, don't waste it on administration. And I love this. This is my Paul Klee. I'd love to have a scarf of this. Every single pedestrian pathway on that campus and that pattern of linkage going across it. So what are you going to do? Because the paths and the linkage don't agree, and you're going to have to think about how you make them agree, particularly where you want things that like the library to be connected. So that tells you what your job is if you accept this as a point of departure. And here you see the student centers and the big student center there, 10 minutes walking distance, which is an important gauge on campuses. And then we took this site and I said, you could do a student union building that in fact crossed over here. You see there's a street through the building. We take transportation and land use planning inside that building. We give it wings like that, but you get across the road, which is here as well. And we give it also a widened landscape where you can use the lake and make it have an amenity as well. So that's a little an indicative plan in very early stages of a building I would like to see there. The idea of doing one building which is kind of going to set the stage for the next development is a good one if you can do this kind of planning. And then here are all the maps we did. And now you know the kind of way we used them. That we took a map, a land use map, and we disaggregated it, and then we superimposed other maps on it, or other variables on it. We mixed the variables that would lead us, like desire lines and NOLI maps, led us to a design. The buildings were actually designed around the desire lines. selecting variables we judge to be key and juxtaposing them. I can't read the end there. Led from data. Oh yes, I like to say data collecting and analysis is a creative act. How you do it will very much affect your design if you want your design to work. But Robert Mitchell used to say to the urban design students, you did this activity, which was a ritual dance for you called data analysis. And then you closed that book and you went to your favorite habit, which was design. So this is all an attempt to get those to work together. And I've shown you examples where we have, and it's made behavior do the things we'd hope it would do without coercing. So that's Xinhua. And just quickly, this is another building analyzed in the same way. There's a little shopping area here. There's another one there. We had this as a big cleared site along a regional arterial, Rue de Serre, Rue Avenue, Rue de Serre, yes. And there's the canal, the Minimes Canal, the Pont de Minimes. It's in Toulouse. It's like a state capital. And so we said, let's take a diagonal across this site. Look at the small scale of its environment. We'll make 2 buildings here rather than just one. And you can go to pay your taxes and things as a pedestrian here. It's also a shortcut between those two. And here is the assembly hall. And underneath is a big parking lot. And the main entrance is here, but there are entrances there and here, etc. And then there are, French call them passerelles, passages between these two at different levels. So people can really understand that plan. They can have an ideogram of it, and they can find where they are. And the whole thing is therefore popular for that reason. It's planned along the same principles, and kids walk to school here. I wanted to get them to use it for a market street, but the president of the Conseil Général wouldn't do that. And look at us fitting into the environment. I love these off-kilter pictures of it, and we always look for a red car. And look at this scale of the utilities. And then here's the scale of the entry, and these are scale elements. There used to be 2 pylons at this place here. And at that position there, they were on the Avenue Rue de Serre. When they widened it, they took them down. So we made memories of them here, flattened. And they kind of take you inside there. They're between your scale and its scale. And then this is the individual scale down there. So I love these combinations of scales in cities. And then these are the kinds of views you get. It doesn't overwhelm you, I think. This is from the canal. And now we sort of collage things to give you the feel of this inside space. There's an ellipse within this diagonal going across. And on the ellipse is the entrance to the Salle de l'Assemblée over here. Here's the entrance going by these pylons. So human beings, Giacometti figures, and then pylons, and then the building itself. The passerelle, beautiful Mediterranean sky and reflected in those. And here you see this thing from the back end. And then I talk about the order of architecture, and that's our order of architecture for this building. But on the front, a little, the Salle de l'Assemblée and obeisance to Le Corbusier in its shape, very much a kind of Le Corbusierian civic shape. But then we do painting in steel and glass. We take Mesian steel, and we put their logo rainbow into it. And that's at the scale of the whole region, whereas this is the scale of individual offices, and every scale in between, and there's the road through. And it's the same principle. And you can see that's the old road, which they widened, and there are the columns. Now, you see here, that's where our building is, and our road is there. And while the building was in construction, we found an old map. And I was amazed to see that exactly where we had put that diagonal shortcut, there had once been a road. So it was a palimpsest that we sensed because of the relationships and put back. Now, I want to show you some pictures, and I'm sorry because it's taking a long time and I'm going to have to go fast. So this is me taking photographs before the Las Vegas studio when I got to Los Angeles, but I've been taking these photographs in Africa and Europe, everyday architecture, and the automobile city of the West, and I want to go quickly through these. I've got about 20,000 of them. You're not going to see all 20,000. And I hope they haven't been looked at since I stopped taking photographs, and they're very fresh. They haven't faded with use. And I hope to have an exhibition with them, but I have to go very quickly now. That's South African desert, and that's Nevada desert. I say mine is an African view of Las Vegas, but I can't tell you why now. That's me taking photographs. I shoot first, and then I work out later, because that's the best time. If you miss it, you've missed it, so I just shoot. You can see that's entering San Francisco from the Bay Bridge. It's Las Vegas. That's Santa Monica. These predate Rouchet and all those people, early 60s, 1965 mainly. I still love them. They really, were kind of what our eyes were full of as we approached. And then came our Las Vegas study. And now I'm going to go through that quickly because you now know the principles. That was the Yale students and me under a big sign. Steve Eisenhower there too. I love this. Signs in space before, symbols in space before form in space. And that just says it. And that too, actually, the purity of that light was Greek. And I kept thinking of why they painted the Acropolis multicolored as I looked at this. And then look at the permanence of this old hill back here. And how different the signs are. You don't miss those signs because of that. They're so different. So there's so much to learn from this. Now this is our rostrum with its kind of monumental people. Here is Caesar's palace with its monumental centurions that are looking out against their legions of parked cars, the relationship with people. This too generates people. And Gian Bologna with anatomical improvements over here. And of course the funny thing is Las Vegas is Steve Wynn's city. He got rid of all the neon, so at that time, after this era, it was his city. And Wynn Commons is who this was named for. He gave the money for this, he went to Penn. Bob wanted me to take Avis digging its elbow into Venus. And I wanted the centurion looking at his legions of cars. We didn't get much from Howard Hughes by way of a contribution, but he did give us an hour in his helicopter, which we used very well. That is the boneyard. Russians come here and they say, oh, look, there's the Stardust sign. And people say, how do you know that's the Stardust sign? From learning from Las Vegas. There's me looking at how those signs that I'd seen in the 60s were actually made. And here we put every sign on a certain part of the strip down. Another approaches to mapping. I'll go through these quickly. The land use map that taught us so much, and you can see the strips here. Remember that pattern because it comes up. We abstract that, you see. Every strip there, but look at the grain, as Kevin Lynch called it, of that, which is the strip compared with the other strips. If you don't get a wonderful feeling of structure and growth and things architects love from these. It's poring over these Noli maps and air maps has been part of what has been all the fun. So now here you see these casinos here. There's so much more that we did here than what the people who have gone back to Las Vegas have done. They just did Las Vegas then and Las Vegas now. Noli maps, distribution maps, and much more. Change and permanence. There's so much. If you look at learning from Las Vegas, you see all the studies that we did. So here are the casinos and the patios and the valet parking. And we said those were like the churches in the Noli map. And then we abstracted those from here. Then we surrounded them by the private sector, you could say. So that's the strip's Noli map. And then this is the nearest thing we could get to the feeling of the strip. It told you what each sign was advertising: casino, motel, gas station. But it gives a feeling of the lights. The kinds of orthogonal presentation that we do, or land use planning that we do, doesn't show the complexity of things like signs, which read as a teeny little strip on a land use map, and they have all this importance. So that's the reason. Thinking about mapping, how do you map to show what you're trying to show? Now, here's Bob taking me and me taking Bob. Bob is taking a picture of someone for a record. I'm thinking of Magritte. I'm thinking about mannerism. I'm thinking about scale differences. And mine is very, very forced, but the combination is fun. And then it's me who puts it together like that, lining us up, lining the chimney up. That was 1966, and this is now. This in ruins and we in ruins. Thank you. Now, we have questions for anyone who wants, and we also have starters with 3 people asking me some questions, and then it will be over to the audience to continue. And we want to do it quickly, but it's also very much worth doing, I think.
Thank you, Denise. That was really fantastic and inspiring and quite beautiful. I guess maybe I should start.
Yes.
So I wanted to go back to the beginning, and you said something. You said that you understood that you traveled to form questions and find ways to understand them and address them. And I think that's a really, kind of interesting question. One, because of the obvious that it's a kind of position where architecture can only reinvent itself from without and from examining the real, and that its role is to reconnect with the social. But the other aspect is really the notion of traveling, and I wanted to relate it to the school, because I think that the school in particular is very engaged right now with this notion of a kind of travel as the means to kind of grow architectural possibilities and understand the world, and the kind of field work that really kind of learns from what you started. And so I want to learn more, which is how do we map better? I mean, now we can map time, we can we can do so much more, and yet the questions are still what to map, right? I mean, you can have all the tools in the world. It's really what kind of eye do you use to approach a context that you're not familiar with to learn in the best way. And the second is, in your long experience, is there a limit to architecture's social engagement with the social? Not to say that we shouldn't engage it, but how can we learn from those limits to precisely engage it better?
I'd spent a couple of hours on both of those questions.
No, I know, but I
took the planning. I think studio is a very wonderful educational tool, but it was used in a very limited way in architecture. And yet that is the way it's needed to learn a skill. Like riding a bicycle, you don't learn it by reading about it, even though there's a nice book called Zen on the Motorbike. You have to learn it by trying it and falling off and trying it. In studios, you really need that as an architect. But then I began to think also of how Bob and I were having this wonderful time doing research by looking. So, research, looking is our research. And then also planning studios where the students worked as a group, and they had one project and they shared pieces of it, and they compared notes, and they did research for each other, and they shared that, and there was a process of analysis, synthesis, and I explicated it all, and planning faculty members did that. So you go away with a little book, partly because you were probably going to be a teacher and it was useful, but it was good to lay it all out like that. And once that was a pattern, then to say, well, why don't we combine those things? And the kind of research that we're doing when we travel, why don't we do that with students? And then as an African student, we were all told you just have to travel because you're so far away from the center of your kind of mother culture. And how will you know what Mozart is if you don't get to Vienna, you see? Something like that. And I think that's true. So Australian students stayed away even longer than the South African ones from home because they were even further away. But the point being that you needed to see the real thing. And so putting that together, and then I began to think, what in the 1960s, and I was having a lot of experience of running those studios for planning students, and what is it that would really get them? It had to be against the government. It had to be kind of breaking the rules in some way. So then I thought of Herb Gans, and I began to say when I was at UCLA, I was taking all this photography, much more than you saw, and I ran a studio on Santa Monica. My next one will be Las Vegas. And I was going to do it at UCLA, and then Bob came along, and then I was going back. So then I began teaching at Yale, and I said, why don't we do that studio at Yale? And that's how that happened. But now, you can hear that I feel you shouldn't do too many of those studios because you really have skills to learn as well. The approach that we took there was broader than I've shown you, so that the approach of active socioplastics is one of many things we looked at there. And if you look at the Levittown studio, you'll see rather different subject matter. Planners had a set of curricular discussions just as I joined the faculty at Penn, and I learned a great deal from them about how to run a studio. People like Britton Harris, who had an architect wife, had no respect for architecture at all, had this real acumen about what you could do in the studio and what you couldn't, and what was good for 16 weeks and how you couldn't do the whole problem and which piece you should abstract for what purpose and so on. So that's the kind of thinking to do. And then I don't think a studio should just be a junket. And if you don't plan it the way we do, interdisciplinary education got a very bad name later because architects thought they could do it without knowing those things. I can show you even now in Philadelphia, I think a huge mistake has been made with an important building because the architect and the economist who advised the city, the architect never had any courses in urban economics. The economist never learned anything about architecture. Between the two of them, they left a big gap, and the project fell into that gap. I'm waiting for the mayor to discover that. Anyway, so you see what I'm saying, that you have to know enough to do an interdisciplinary studio, or else it's a kind of a fraud. And doing a great junket somewhere may be fun, but it's a waste of academic time.
Right. And have you ever felt that a project that you did fail to kind of engage the social in the best way? I mean,
we all fail because it's so very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But when I began to realize that I got certain things from Herbert Gans to do with is and ought and value systems and understanding of taste cultures and open-mindedness, and then other things from Paul David Duff to do with democratic participation and procedural planning for it, and then other things from Walter Izard to do with how an economy settles out on the land. There's a wonderful book called The Human Use of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Brink Jackson recommended that to me. It's an old book now, but it tells you how the different kinds of economies, when I can say Zululand is a barter and subsistence, which is only half true because the men go and work on the mines. But it's a barter and subsistence economy, and Philadelphia is an advanced capitalist economy. I get that kind of thinking from that book, from Wagner. I think we should go on to another question.
Well, I want to ask you about something that you mentioned very briefly at the beginning of the lecture. For the most part, we saw mostly more recent projects of your office. But for the past 30, maybe even 40 years, you've often been referred to as postmodernist, the work of Venturi Scott Brown, and it's something that you have for a long time refused as a label.
Yes, maybe I can tell you, I can give you the answer.
Okay, well, I want, okay, well, the question was longer, but you can go right ahead.
I know what it is. You say, why do you now say you're a postmodernist?
Well, no, because you brought, just maybe for the audience, because you even in one book you say, you know, hope to counter the stereotypes about us and say why we're never really postmodernists. And then you wrote a beautiful essay, I think, last year for a show in London.
I was stopping you doing a plug for me.
What's that?
I was stopping you doing a plug for my book.
You won't stop me. And in that essay, you're making the distinction between postmodernism and POMO.
Yes. Well,
and
you see,
all
these questions about postmodernism happened, and I can tell you when. We did this exhibition on what's it called? Signs and Symbols in the City. Signs of Life, Symbols in the City. And there was a city room in there. Well, the whole thing was very, very densely argued. All three rooms, the city, the suburb, and sprawl, and the strip. And no one read the whole thing, but Philip Johnson did. And he particularly looked at the city room. And suddenly his postmodernism flowered from that. And people who know him say that's the truth. Well, when I saw what he was doing and what Michael Graves were doing, those people, I said, we're not doing that. And then Bob very strongly felt we weren't doing what they were doing. And so then Bob was quoting HUAC. He was saying, I have not been and never have been a postmodernist, but they said a communist. And so there was a humor in it too, but we felt it very strongly that this thing was being taken to a level that we weren't involved in. And then I began thinking later, it was so much involved with that picture of Martin Luther King. We were doing advocacy planning and stopping an expressway on South Street, absolutely in parallel with doing the Las Vegas study. And also the thinking that came after World War II in many fields was called postmodern, and we very much were part of that, like theological thinking, which said there can be no innocence since the Holocaust. And then a whole genre of writing which was not innocent came out of that. And I thought, we do have common cause with all of that. And why are we removing? We should be pointing out that Philip Johnson was diverging from what we were trying to do. So I said, we are postmodernists. They are something called POMO. Now, that word had been used by other people, and I think it applies very well. And some people will say, well, look, there's a lot of good in POMO in itself. It just wasn't the way we were approaching things. When we're very interested in a life of the mind. We're very interested in things physical. We're very interested in writing. We're very interested in designing, all of them. We much want to bring beauty of different sorts, physical and otherwise. Why should there not be such a thing as economic design? Why do only physical people do design? Of course they do design. When they just call it analysis, they're deceiving everyone, mostly themselves. So when you say that, you're trying to make beauty out of this whole and you're challenged by the whole. Doesn't mean every architect should be that way either. There are many architects who come at it with another way and produce their own very lively, wonderful way. Happens to be the way we do it. And Bob and I do it a little differently too. But so that's the answer.
Actually, you just did this perfect segue into my second question. Sorry, Cristina. But the concept of beauty. We've talked a lot about mapping. The first question was about mapping. But in a conversation we've had a few weeks ago, you said that all the mapping is, in the end, is very important, but in the end it's a tool to achieve beauty.
Well, it's a tool to achieve socioplastics, to achieve beauty, but in the doing of all the other things, you want also to arrive at something that is beautiful. And then it's very difficult to define that because many people have different views, and there's a long discussion about how do you make City Hall so that all the people, like the Archie Bunker show, everyone loved that, and there was something for everyone by way of beauty or love in that show. Well, what's the equivalent of that? Well, don't you need that now that we have Comcast? Everyone's taste. Herb Gann said you won't need to do for combined beauties because you'll have, but I don't agree. City Hall still needs to have civic meanings and then personal incrustation of private meanings. And there's a long discussion in the context of beauty about how you do all that. And in the end, I'm saying the kind of beauty that I like is what I call agonized. It comes out of looking at very hard problems and producing the difficult solutions that the hard problems need, and looking very hard at them. And you know, Lou used to say, you say it's ugly, and you say it's ugly, and it's ugly, and you say it's ugly, until you say it's beautiful because it's the way it has to be. And I say that's what changes sensibility, and it comes out of social change. So social change leads to these hard questions for architects. A final inability to push it under the rug, having to look at it square, and then finding a new way to make something beautiful. But the beauty that comes in the beginning is agonized. You know, look, Picasso said of the maids of Avignon, other artists will make it beautiful. It's ugly because it's the first time. And so I think there's all these ways of defining beauty.
How does the concept of taste?
Oh, there's just one other thing. Sorry. I just want to say, having said all that, I think it's better to also work by indirection, to work very hard at the problem and let the beauty emerge. And you say, oh, gee, look, I made it beautiful. I'll say, I'm going to create beauty now. And I'm going to use this as my inspiration, and that is my inspiration, because I decide that's a good inspiration. You know, Bob has been known to look at a fountain and say, it's going to be like an Edwardian lady's feathered hat. Well, if that's what gives him the inspiration, good for him. Doesn't matter. What matters is whether the fountain is a good fountain. Okay, I must go on to another question.
Okay, so I want to ask you about this amazing collection of photography you have, and you have shown us a bit. I know you're in the making of a book right now on this collection with a publisher is here, Diana Murphy from Metropolis Books, DAP. And I have, I don't know, about the idea of the artist, no? We're talking about mapping, but being an architect is a very complex thing. And part of it for you has been this taking photography since your last teens to almost your 40 years old throughout 3 continents, Africa, South Africa, Europe, and the US. So I would like us I would like you to explain us, like, what's your view, what's your eye, what's your art, what do you see in photography, and what have you been seeing throughout all these very forming years through this lens?
Well, first of all, I think you know these 2 questioners, everyone here, but does everyone know Cristina Guadalupe Galván? And she's a Spanish architect living in New York and working with me on a lot of this work now. She and I together, she helped me put the slide lecture and make the combinations, and we were working very hard together yesterday. And I think I have an eye, and I know what it is I want to photograph. Sometimes I don't know why, and as I say, I've learned to do it anyway. And then I think partly that also there's the curatorial art. You put two things together and you learn. They look like that, the way with that beach scene. What's it? Why am I finding it so exciting? And then you learn something by doing that. Well, I think photography is a lot like that. Doing a slide lecture is really a curatorial act. And it's such fun to suddenly see something in a combination you first found beautiful. So all of that is to do with my eye. Looking at that desert scene of the backs of the casinos and that chimney, discovering that chimney and saying, oh gee, look at that and look at that building, and they're about the same height. You know, you don't quite verbalize it, you take it first. And I'd see Bob in his black suit. Why was he wearing that in the desert? I said, look what we've got here. We've got Magritte. Just stand a little bit more this way. So I was doing a lot of looking at art galleries in Europe, and I love early modern painting, and I don't lose those things. I grew up in a 1930s international style house that my mother commissioned. 1934, the house. And so all of that I love, and so does Bob. And he says his favorite building of the 20th century is the Villa Savoye. So then the question is, I use all of that. When I looked at the painting White on White by Malevich, that's been very important in the kind of organizing of photography I do. I think there's a real photographer here, Wayne, who's been working with us too. He's going to criticize my technology of photography, my techniques. But I'm not in it for that. I'm in it for... I was rummaging around at Penn when I was working on that project that I did before I did the plan for Penn, and in the back of an old church there, and there was a kind of a garbage area, and it was covered with ivy on the ground. And in that ivy was chucked out a cookie tin. And so there were all these green ivies, and then bright, simplified, photographic flowers, you know, the kind of thing you call chocolate box, except it was cookie tin. Well, that was a perfect circle with these flowers photographed in these brilliant colors in all this greenery. And I just took it. Well, I use that as an example of man-made design and natural-made design, how the one is very simple compared with the other. And so that's the kind of thing I do with photography. I sense something, and then these funny relationships. I love the one with the mirror where you saw the bridge and then the city. And the city is crooked, you can see, and the mirror is crooked another way. I think I got it just right. It was also a revelation to me one day when Robert and I had taken a photograph out of the tower of the Palazzo at Siena. That one is on the square, which has a tall tower. It's the municipal building, and you could see out into the strips of Siena that grow out, and the countryside comes in. And we took a record shot of that. We wanted to remember that, and that's been important to us. But I saw a photograph by Cartier-Bresson, the same thing, but his organization of the photograph was so subtly different and so much better. And it was really fascinating to see. So that's all I can say about that, Cristina. We want to have an exhibition of this photography. We are going to do a book on it, and I'm hoping also, and we've got to get through the digitizing of them all, and then choose the ones that best explicate. And I prefer to have a whole lot, not just some carefully selected things on white walls. Thank you. I think we should now go. Yes,
open it up.
We should. Over there. Is there a microphone or something that we can hear with? Yeah. Yes. Who did you put your hand up over there?
I had a kind of question about, I guess, an overall process that involves your kind of analysis of urban spaces. This is kind of like the master question that everyone answers, which is, the answer is always going to be like architects can only do so much. But it seems like in your process, you take kind of like the world and you analyze it. You have these desired paths and these gorgeous diagrams, and you in your practice, and you create this kind of answer, which is a kind of spatial solution, right? But it seems like the initial, what you take in, it has space, but it also has real estate and economics. And
sorry, I can't hear you. What you take in has what?
Has all these other things like real estate, economics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, etc. And then the output is like space, And if we did that again, it's kind of like a losing proposition. And I'm not talking about your work. I guess I'm talking about architecture in general. And so it seems to me that there's this kind of like narrowing that keeps on happening. Like the output of our work is space, but then there are all these other things that we didn't output. We don't output psychology, we don't output real estate, etc. And so I guess my question is, how much is the end goal of that just kind of this narrowing where we become, or like we can only do these kind of acupunctural interventions? And do you see this kind of like an alternative or a kind of an out to that? Or is the answer to say, well, architects can only do so much because the forces behind us are bigger, there's capital, etc.?
It's a very, very complex question. And you see, I say we should have a wide window called architecture. Architecture is my window for looking at the world. So it comes through the mesh of whatever I have learned to do what I do. But then there's also what you look at through that mesh. And I'm suggesting widening of what we look at, of the view we see from our window, to include many more disciplines. Like we've learned how to import structure into education about architecture and also history. There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing the same thing with the social sciences. And I have had considerable education in planning in the social sciences now. And so when I say I am going to narrow it down into these patterns, the patterns are informed by a wider understanding, and that helps me choose which variables, as they would say, I choose. In some places one, in some places others. But there's a certain piece of architecture which is a relationship of elements. And when you first start studying and you do a very simple plan, you may or may not do goose eggs and link them with movement systems. That's a simple way to teach beginning architects about the arrangement of things. And they're very oversimplified, obviously. So it's interesting to also think of how you teach really beginning students more than that at the same time as they have to learn relationships. And they're never going to get to be able to do architecture if they don't know the width of a door, the size of a toilet. When Bob does his houses, very often the thing that's sketched in with most detail first is the bathrooms, because these are scalar elements in a way, and relationship elements. But so that's the kind of way in which I'm looking at these patterns. They are like that, and there are many meta patterns which can't be treated that way, but in the end everything is going to get translated into bricks and mortar. And that book by Paul Wagner gave me some very interesting ideas of how life, primitive life, or post-communist countries and communist countries and capitalist countries translate things into form. And by the way, there's not so much difference either, because it really is a measure of effort. But effort gets translated into money in different ways. That's why I'm careful always to point out that a university can get to be right at the center of a town because it's part of a power structure, even if it isn't the activity patterns of people paying rent to afford to be where they are. And then, of course, one of the roles of government is to help people who don't have the money to still operate in those areas, whatever Romney is saying now. By the way, that's another thing. They say you either didn't get help from government or you did get help from government. Planning is full of a complex philosophy, which I'm sure Obama isn't saying for some reasons, about leveraging $10 of private sector money by $1 of public sector money. And so that sort of thinking is also what I'm bringing into all of this. And you can put it in dollars, or you can put it in terms of effort, or you can put it in terms of power, or you can, but there has to be some way in which you can think of how it's going to get to be physical. Yeah.
Stava, happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you.
And during my studies about you, about your masterpiece, Learning from Las Vegas, I read an interview where you said that a period that was really important for your next work was the 16 and the 17, especially...
No, I'm not hearing you. There's something...
what?
I don't know if you have to hold the mic a little bit...
Further? Okay. Like this?
Yes, better,
okay,
yes.
Sorry. And you refer about the exhibition, This is Tomorrow, and the group. There are one, of course, the popular art group with Hamilton, but also the one in the group 6 with the brutalism, we can say they were called, Smithsonian and Paolozzi. So
I'm not, someone's going to have to, you want to come here and tell me what the question is?
Talk slower, because your accent, I think.
I'm sorry for my Italian accent.
Vuol farlo in italiano?
Parlo in italiano, meglio?
Sarebbe più difficile.
Molto bene. Se preferisce io parlo in italiano.
No, sarebbe troppo difficile.
Troppo difficile. Ma mi risponde benissimo. Bene, okay, I try to repeat. Okay, so This is Tomorrow, the exhibition, two group, popular art group at Smithsonian and so brutalist group, we can say. And seems that you bring from both of these two groups, in a sense, you try to combine the popular art, so design, what they bring to us for the view, and also the things of the experience that the Smithsonian try to say in that exhibition. So space and privacy, so like your interest in only plan. I don't know if it starts from then, but it seems really that you try to combine popular, so sign and what they are saying, and experience, so common in a sense, common and real experience of the people. I don't know if could be.
I was very influenced by the brutalists, and also by, I was not in agreement with some of the Italian people who did housing in the 1950s, but some of them I was, and very influential on us was Giuseppe Vaccaro, and I worked for him for a short while. But it started long before that with Africa, and you see, I just couldn't talk about everything. I've written about that, and in that article on socioplastics, I've tried to show how those same themes occurred in the 3 different continents in different ways. And so there was a lot of this brewing in London, the whole thing about popular culture. But I had before that seen it in Africa. When I say I have an African view of Las Vegas, it was very easy for the people who, particularly from England, who went to Africa, to say, it is only a beautiful landscape if it looks like England. So you'd see English people saying, that piece here could be a little bit of Surrey. And I say, why does it have to look like Surrey to be beautiful? And then I got to England, and the argument there was that everyone should think like the planners. So the one was an argument about cultural dominance from a metropolitan group. The other was cultural dominance from upper middle class values on working class values. And that was the big problem in England then. And so those two meshed. And then I came to America, and quite soon it was civil liberties. And all those ideas that I've been asking questions about, here they were being discussed as value systems, as relation between is and ought, the normative and the descriptive, and as big issues in planning. And so I started with the questions about them, and I began to see that you could think about them in many ways, and then to find ways to deal with them specifically in projects. Does that help?
In this corner. You wrote in your book, published by the AA, in a couple of essays. In one of them, you wrote about the role of women in architecture, relating your experience to the last.
Can we hold the question a second? Because I think. Sing happy birthday. Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Denise. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. Can we have a photograph of that? Did you see it as it came by? It's got that picture of me on it. Thank you very much for this very, very warm-hearted welcome.
So maybe the best thing is, I know many of you have questions, but a lot of you would just like to come and say hello to Denise, which is something special. So I think we should just join her here and celebrate a wonderful lecture and a great person.
Thank you very, very much. But let me just say one thing. All of us want to hear that debate, which is happening at 9 o'clock. I would have wished we could have gone on doing it together, because it's so relevant to all these issues. I think if he comes in a second time, we get some of these things actually discussed in the terms that they should be, because people won't be afraid then. I hope so. Thank you, and a toast to everyone. Thank you. I wish Bob could be here, but it's not suitable for him to be traveling in this way now.
That was totally stunning.
No.
I've never seen it so like photo.
Yes, someone tried very hard.
We cut up the never affected.